Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine silence, not the soft, comfortable kind, the kind where your heart beats just a little faster, the kind that tells you something in the air has changed. During the Second World War, silence became its own language. Ordinary people learned to read it the way you read a familiar face. They understood what it meant, what it was warning them about, what it was quietly hiding. Tonight, as you settle in and let your body relax, we will wander gently through these quiet moments together. The times when nothing was said, when no sound was made, and yet everyone in the room understood perfectly. Let these facts wash over you slowly. There is no hurry here, just simple, true stories about how silence spoke when words could not. Fact number 1. In the autumn of 1939, it was the children of London who noticed it first, not the adults. The adults were too busy managing too many things at once, but the children had not yet learned to fill silence with noise. Their attention to the quality of the air around them had not yet been trained away. What they noticed was the silence of the streets at night. It had changed. Before the war, the London night had its own texture of sound, traffic, voices, the distant rumble of the underground, the particular acoustic life of a large city that never quite goes to sleep. But after the blackout began, on the 1st of September 1939, all of that texture was gone. The streets were dark, and they were quiet in a way they had never been quiet before. Children lying awake in their beds wrote about it in letters and described it years later in recorded interviews. There was an unease to it that the darkness alone did not explain. The silence was the thing. It was too complete, too different from everything that had come before. It was the silence of something held back rather than something simply absent. It was the first silence of the war, and it told anyone listening carefully enough that the world had changed in a way the world did not yet know how to sound. Fact number 2. Wartime telegrams arrived in envelopes you could recognize before you opened them. The buff-colored paper, the particular weight of it in the hand, the way the delivery boy stood on the doorstep without quite meeting your eyes. These were signals the body registered before the mind had time to form the thought they implied. Women who answered the door to one of these envelopes described a specific physical response, a stopping of normal function, a narrowing of everything down to the object in the hand, and then silence. A silence that fell over the house in the few seconds between receiving the envelope and opening it. That silence between receiving and knowing was one of the most dreaded experiences of the entire war. It lasted only seconds, but in those seconds everything was still possible. The news might be difficult, but not the worst. The worst had not yet happened, because the envelope had not yet been opened. Families described this moment with a precision that decades had not blurred, because the nervous system stores certain things at a different depth than ordinary memory. The house was quiet, the world outside continued, and in the hand the envelope waited with almost a kind of patience, holding its information for one more moment, before the silence ended and everything changed. Fact number 3. Occupied Paris had a sound to it in the summer of 1940 that the people who lived through it described for the rest of their lives as the sound of wrongness. The city was not silent exactly. The Germans who arrived on the 14th of June brought their own noise. Trucks, boots on cobblestones, orders spoken in an unfamiliar language. But what was silent was everything French. The cafes that had always been full of conversation and the gentle sound of glasses were quiet in a way that had nothing to do with their being closed. The streets that had always carried the particular personality of Paris, its vendors and arguments and music drifting from open windows, were now inhabited by a muffled version of themselves. Parisians described it as the city holding its breath. Every French voice seemed lower, every French conversation shorter and more careful. The natural, easy social volume of a famously sociable city had been turned down to a level that had no natural explanation except the one explanation nobody wanted to say out loud. The silence was the sound of a population that had understood something and was not yet ready to speak about what it had understood. It was the silence of dignity trying to hold itself together in the presence of an occupation it had not chosen and could not yet see how to resist. Fact number 4. Halfway through a meal, a family might simply stop talking, not because anything had been said, but because something had arrived from outside, or because something had stopped. A sound that changed the quality of the air in the room. This happened across every bombed city of the war. It was described consistently by civilians from London, Hamburg, Tokyo and Manila alike. The meal continued on the surface, forks were still held, food was still on the plates, but the conversation that had accompanied it was gone, replaced by a quiet, collective attention directed outward, toward the window, toward the sky, toward whatever the silence or the new sound was trying to say. Children noticed that the adults had stopped talking before they understood why. They looked at their parents and found their parents looking elsewhere, wearing the expression of people listening to something the children could not yet hear. This mid-meal silence was one of the more intimate wartime experiences. It happened at the most ordinary of moments. The family gathered, food shared, the regular evening proceeding, and its arrival announced, without a single word, that the ordinary evening was no longer ordinary, that whatever was outside had moved closer than it had been a moment before. Fact number 5. Radio silence had a technical meaning during the war. It meant the deliberate stopping of transmissions to avoid detection, but it had a civilian meaning too, and the civilian version was felt in the body like something close to physical pain. Families who had grown used to receiving letters from absent husbands or sons at roughly regular intervals understood, without needing to be told, what it meant when the letters stopped. The post was unreliable, delays were common, any particular silence might have an innocent explanation, but the body did not accept innocent explanations as readily as the mind tried to offer them. A silence between letters that stretched from 1 week into 2, and then into a month, produced a sustained physical vigilance that daily tasks could occupy but never quite suppress. Women described checking the post with a regularity that had moved beyond hope into something closer to compulsion, not because they believed the checking would produce the letter, but because the alternative, remaining in the silence without doing anything about it, was simply too heavy to sit with. Fact number 6. Some silences during the war were deliberately created by people who understood that speaking was dangerous. In occupied Poland, the Netherlands, France, Belgium and Norway, conversations that would have been entirely ordinary in peacetime were simply not spoken aloud in places where the wrong person might hear. Opinions about the occupiers, news heard on the BBC, knowledge of resistance activity, information about Jewish neighbors, all of it pressed below the threshold of speech. This enforced silence was not the absence of thought, it was thought and opinion pressed down below the surface by the clear knowledge of what speaking might cost. People who lived under occupation for years described the specific mental discipline this required, the constant internal editing of what was about to be said, the automatic self-censorship that eventually functioned below the level of conscious awareness. Children who grew up under occupation absorbed this silence as part of the normal grammar of their world. They learned without being explicitly taught that certain things were said only inside the house, only to certain people, only in certain circumstances, and that the silence maintained in all other situations was not rudeness or ignorance. It was a form of protection that everyone around them was practicing, and that they were expected to practice too. Fact number 7. After a bombing raid, the silence that followed the all clear was different from any other silence. It was not the silence of safety, it was the silence of assessment, of a population collectively taking stock of what the previous hours had done and had not done. People emerged from shelters into streets that were either recognizable or not, and the quality of the silence in which they emerged was shaped entirely by what they found. A street where nothing had changed was quiet in one way. A street where buildings were gone was quiet in another way entirely. That second kind of silence had a specific texture to it. The silence of absence made physical, of space that had been occupied and was now not, of structures that had stood for decades and were simply gone. Firefighters and rescue workers who spent the hours after raids in these silences described them as among the most disturbing of their wartime experiences, not the noise of the raid itself, which had a terrible but comprehensible logic, but the silence afterward, moving through a changed landscape, listening for voices beneath the rubble, a form of listening so intense that the entire body became an instrument of hearing, straining toward the specific sound, a cry, a tapping, a breath, that would mean someone down there was still alive. Fact number 8. Dogs knew before people did. This is not a romantic claim. It is reported consistently enough across enough different wartime sources to deserve to be taken seriously as a genuine observation about animal perception. Dogs in bombed cities across Britain and Germany began showing signs of agitation, restlessness, unusual alertness directed toward the sky, minutes before the arrival of aircraft that human ears had not yet detected. Families who had learned to watch their dogs used this as an early warning system of real practical value. They began moving toward the shelter when the dog became restless, rather than waiting for the sirens that would arrive minutes later. What is interesting about this, from the perspective of wartime silence, is what the dog's behavior meant inside a quiet house. The sudden alertness, the movement toward the door, the particular quality of attention, all of it happening in silence, before any other signal had arrived. The dog had heard something in the quiet that the quiet had not yet delivered to its owners. Its restlessness was the first word of a sentence the sky was about to complete. Fact number 9. By 1942, people living in heavily bombed areas had developed a practical expertise in the sounds of aircraft that they had acquired entirely through experience. They could distinguish with reasonable reliability between the engine sound of Allied aircraft and German ones, a difference that meant the difference between danger and reassurance. The silence between aircraft sounds, the gap between one formation passing and the possible arrival of another, was therefore a silence that needed to be read carefully, its length and quality assessed for what it might mean. A silence that extended long enough was relief. A silence followed by an unfamiliar sound was alarm, and a silence that simply continued past the point at which the expected sound should have arrived, and kept growing, was its own message, readable to a population that had learned this particular language at considerable personal cost. The ability to read silence as information, to decode its length and quality for practical intelligence about what was happening in the sky overhead, was one of the more unusual skills that the wartime experience developed in ordinary people, and one of the more complete demonstrations that silence, far from being an absence, is a medium as full of content as any other. Fact number 10. A classroom that went quiet when it should not have was something wartime teachers learned to recognize as a signal worth attending to. 30 children who had been making the ordinary noise of children, suddenly producing no noise at all, unordered, unannounced. It was a collective sensory response to something the children had absorbed and were processing without yet knowing how to speak about. In occupied countries, teachers described this silence falling over classrooms on days when something had happened in the town, an arrest, a raid, a new restriction announced. The children had absorbed the atmosphere of their households that morning and carried it into school without being able to name it. The teacher, reading the room's silence, understood that the lesson being prepared was not what was actually needed. What was needed was either a gentle acknowledgement of what had been sensed, or the specific warmth of a lesson pursued with enough regularity to become its own form of reassurance. The silent classroom was not an absence of learning, it was learning of a particular kind, the absorption of difficult reality into young nervous systems doing their very best to find somewhere to put it, in the quiet hope that an adult in the room would help them find the place. Fact number 11. Before the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the border regions of Western Russia and Ukraine experienced a specific quality of quiet in the days immediately before the attack. The birds had gone. This detail appears in enough independent accounts, from different villages, different regions, different people who could not have coordinated their recollections, to be taken seriously as a genuine observed phenomenon. The birds that had inhabited the fields and forests along the Soviet western border were absent in the days before the 22nd of June. Their absence left a stillness over the landscape that the people who noticed it felt as wrong without being able to explain why. Animals register disturbance through channels that human perception cannot access. The massed military movement on the other side of the border, more than 3 million men, thousands of vehicles, artillery and armor assembled for the largest land invasion in history, produced vibrations and disturbances that reached the birds before they reached the people. The silence the birds left behind was the first signal of what was coming. By the time the guns opened at 3 in the morning on the 22nd of June, the border regions had been quiet for days. A quiet that in retrospect had been anything but peaceful. Fact number 12. What a village sounds like when half its men have gone, is something the women left behind noticed in the weeks after mobilization in a way they found difficult to put into words but impossible to ignore. Rural communities across France, Britain, Germany, the Soviet Union and Japan felt this acoustic change in 1939 and 1940 as the drafts took their share of each community's male population. The farmers, the tradesmen, the young men whose voices and daily presence had been woven into the soundscape of a place in ways that only their absence made fully audible. The blacksmith's workshop was quiet. The pub at evening had a different sound, fewer voices, a different register. A particular quality of reduced energy that was about more than simple numbers. Work that had generated specific sounds, the sounds of fields being worked, animals being managed, trades being practiced, was either not happening or happening differently. Several rural diarists from this period describe walking through their village in the early months of the war and being stopped by the specific quality of its quiet, not the pleasant quiet of a peaceful morning, but the particular quiet of a place that was missing something it had always had, something so familiar that its absence could be heard before it could be named. Fact number 13. Silence on the other side of a wall could mean a great many things in wartime. People who lived in close proximity to others, in the terraced houses of British cities, the apartment buildings of Paris and Warsaw, the densely inhabited streets of Tokyo, developed a heightened sensitivity to the acoustic life of their neighbors that peacetime had never required. You knew in the ordinary course of wartime urban life, the broad pattern of sounds from the house or flat next door, the morning routine, the meal times, the particular habits of a household you had never entered but whose daily rhythms had become, through proximity, as familiar as your own. When those familiar sounds stopped, when the morning routine that should have been audible through the shared wall was simply not there, the silence left behind was information. It might mean absence, which was one thing. It might mean arrest, which was another thing entirely. And in occupied cities, arrest was a possibility that gave the silence through a shared wall a weight that ordinary neighborly awareness had never been asked to carry. People described the experience of realizing a neighbor had gone, hearing the silence that had replaced the ordinary sounds of a household, as one of the more quietly devastating experiences of occupation, not arriving with the drama of a public event, but in the most private and domestic of registers, the silence on the other side of a wall that had always until now been full. Fact number 14. Nurses in field hospitals during heavy casualty periods described a specific silence that descended over the ward in the hours before dawn. Not the silence of patients sleeping, which had its own qualities of breath and occasional movement, but the silence of patients who were very still in a way that required a nurse's attention before she could be certain of what it meant. Moving through a ward in that specific pre-dawn quiet, checking each bed with the calm efficiency that months of training had built, was one of the more demanding forms of silence the wartime medical experience produced. It demanded a quality of attentiveness so complete it excluded everything else. The nurse's own tiredness, the sounds from outside the ward, the knowledge of how many patients remained to be checked, and how few hours remained before the morning shift. Each small sound confirmed something worth confirming. A breath, a shift in position, a murmured word from someone in the borderland between sleep and waking, each one a small piece of information the body registered before the mind finished processing it. The silence was not peaceful, it was the medium through which the work of the ward was conducted in its most concentrated form. The silence not of rest but of listening, sustained across the long hours of a night that had too many patients in it and not enough of anything else. Fact number 15. When the news was very bad, people sometimes stopped using words altogether for a while. This is documented in enough wartime accounts, from enough different people in enough different circumstances, to be recognized as a genuine and consistent human response to news that exceeds the immediate capacity for verbal processing. A woman who received word of her husband's death might sit in a chair for an hour without speaking, and the people around her who loved her might also be silent, because there was nothing adequate to say and they knew it. Saying something inadequate felt worse than saying nothing. Wartime bereavement workers, a newly improvised profession that the scale of wartime loss had called into existence, noted consistently that the silence of acute grief was not a problem to be solved. It was a state to be respected and accompanied. Sitting with a person in their silence, being present without requiring speech from them or offering speech they could not yet receive. This was described by experienced wartime grief workers as among the most important and most demanding of their skills. The ability to remain present and useful in a silence that held more weight than most conversations could carry, and to understand that the silence was not emptiness, it was fullness of a kind that had no other form available to it yet. Fact number 16. The guns stopping was supposed to be the sound of relief, and it was, eventually, but in the immediate moment when a barrage that had been running for hours or days suddenly ceased, what soldiers on both sides of the line described was not relief, it was disorientation. The sound had been so continuous it had ceased to register as a sound at all. It had become the ambient condition of existence, and when it stopped, men described their nervous systems simply not knowing how to receive the change. The silence arrived like a physical thing, a pressure change, a new and unfamiliar quality of air. They were not safe in the silence. They did not feel safe in it. They felt exposed, oddly visible, deprived of the covering noise that the barrage had provided in its own terrible way. The silence after the guns stopped was the silence in which the next thing would happen, and the next thing might be an advance, or a counterattack, or a negotiation, or nothing at all. The silence held all of these possibilities at once without distinguishing between them, and the men sitting in it, after days of noise, were left to wait inside it, without the sound that had paradoxically given the terrible hours preceding it a kind of terrible coherence. Fact number 17. In the Warsaw Ghetto, silence at certain hours carried a specific and understood meaning that its residents had learned through accumulated experience. The sound of trucks arriving in the early morning had become by 1942 a signal that the day would not be ordinary. Vehicles at that specific hour, in that specific pattern, meant a deportation action was beginning, or that a search was underway. When those mornings arrived silently, no trucks, no unusual movement, the ghetto producing only its ordinary sounds of a community beginning its day, the silence was a relief of a particular and exhausted kind, a temporary reprieve, understood clearly as temporary. But the silence had a more specific quality too. It was a listening silence, a silence in which the community's collective attention was directed outward, toward the sounds that would determine what the day would become. The ghetto had developed, from sheer necessity, a community-wide sensitivity to acoustic information that transformed the most ordinary sounds and silences into a continuous intelligence system, a survival technology built entirely from attention. Fact number 18. Submarines running silent existed in a specific relationship with silence that surface sailors never experienced, and that submariners described as among the most psychologically demanding aspects of their service. Engines reduced to minimum, crew forbidden from making noise. Every non-essential system shut down to reduce the acoustic signature. The silence was not chosen. It was imposed by necessity, by the proximity of enemy vessels above, by the knowledge that sound travels efficiently through water, and that the sounds made inside the hull would reach the ears of those searching for them. Crew members described the discipline of running silent as a form of collective breath-holding, a communal physical restraint that extended across the entire vessel and required every man aboard to manage not just his own actions but his own involuntary responses to fear. A cough suppressed at significant physical cost, a dropped tool caught before it hit the deck, the specific effort of remaining still when the body's instinct was toward movement, all of this in a silence that the crew were maintaining themselves, out of the materials of their own will and physical control, in a vessel surrounded by water, as much hidden from the enemy by the quality of its crew's voluntary silence as by its depth below the surface. Fact number 19. There is a silence specific to the moment of opening a letter that everyone in the room knows contains news that will change something. It is not a long silence. The reading of a letter takes only minutes, but it is a complete one. The room reorganizing itself around the reader in a way that everyone present participates in without discussion. Other activities are suspended. Other conversations do not begin. The people who are not reading wait in a specific quality of stillness that is not passivity but a form of active accompaniment, being present for whatever the letter contains, making themselves available for whatever the reading will require. Wartime letters from the front carried this weight routinely. Some women read alone first, in a separate room, processing the contents before sharing them with children or elderly parents. Others read communally, the letter passed from hand to hand, the silence of reading shared rather than private. Either way, the silence in which the letter was read was among the most loaded of wartime domestic experiences, a silence that held for its duration every possible version of what the letter might say, and released only one of them. Fact number 20. After a soldier had been home on leave for a week and the morning came when he had to return, the house he left behind had a specific quality of silence that his family described in terms that went well beyond someone simply going to work. His absence was a different kind of absence. It was an absence with a destination that could not be visited, a duration that could not be predicted, and a set of possible outcomes that the family managed not to speak about but could not entirely prevent themselves from feeling. The silence his departure left in the house was noticed by everyone in it, often in different rooms at different moments. The chair where he had sat, the cup he had used that morning, sitting on the draining board still unwashed because washing it felt too final. The specific absence of his voice in rooms where his voice had been for a whole week. Children who had spent the leave relearning the physical presence of a father they had been missing for months felt his re-departure as a second loss, not as sharp as the first, but with its own particular quality. The silence of someone freshly missed rather than long missed. The wound reopened just as it had been beginning to settle. The house was quiet. It would stay quiet. Everyone in it knew what the quiet meant. Fact number 21. Market day in a French village under occupation had a sound to it that traders who remembered both before and after the Germans arrived could not easily describe but immediately recognized. Before the occupation, the weekly market had been loud in the way that French markets are loud. Overlapping conversations, the calls of vendors, the specific sociability of people who had come to buy and sell but who were also, and perhaps primarily, there simply to see each other. By 1941 the market continued. The stalls were set up, the goods were laid out, transactions were conducted, but the sound of it had changed. Conversations were shorter, voices were lower. The particular quality of public ease that characterizes a community gathering among people who trust each other had been replaced by something more careful and more contained. People still talked, but they talked with one part of attention always directed outward, toward who else was present, toward who might be listening, toward the calculation of what was safe to say and to whom. This altered acoustic quality of the occupied market was not dramatic enough to attract official notice. It was simply the sound of a community that had learned to be careful, conducting its ordinary business in the specific register of people who understood that ordinary business was no longer entirely safe. Fact number 22. Pilots returning from operations over Germany described a specific moment during debriefing that several of them recorded in memoirs and letters with unusual precision. The debriefing room was where crews gathered after landing to give their account of the mission. It was a functional, procedural space, meant to be factual and operational. But there were moments when a crew came in and sat down and the intelligence officer looked at his list and then at the room and the numbers did not match, when the room went quiet in a way that no procedural framework could contain. The empty chairs were silent. The crews who were present felt the absence of the crews who were not, with a physical specificity that the business-like atmosphere of the room was designed to manage but could not always succeed in managing. Some men described looking at the chair where a specific friend had sat the previous evening and finding that the looking required more from them than they had available at that moment. The debriefer continued with his questions. The answers were given, the forms were completed, and the empty chairs remained empty in the specific silence of things that had been present and were not present anymore. Fact number 23. Something happened to the sound of a house the morning after a death in it. People who experienced this during the war described a quality of domestic silence that was different from the silence of a house whose inhabitants were simply absent. The objects were the same objects. The rooms were the same. The light coming through the windows was the same light it had always been. And yet the house sounded different, not quieter in any measurable acoustic sense, but quieter in a way that the people moving through it felt in their bodies before they could articulate it in their thoughts. Grief researchers studying bereavement accounts from the wartime period noted this phenomenon with some frequency, the perception of a changed acoustic quality in a space following the death of someone who had inhabited it, a silence that the bereaved described as the house knowing. Whether the house knew anything is not the point. What is the point is what that perception tells us about the relationship between human presence and domestic space, about the way a person's habitual sounds and movements become so woven into the felt experience of a place that their permanent absence changes the place in ways that the people remaining in it perceive before they have fully understood what they have lost. Fact number 24. Reconnaissance pilots flying over enemy territory at high altitude in unarmed aircraft had a relationship with silence that differed from almost every other wartime flying experience. Their job was to photograph, not to fight, to cross enemy airspace as quickly and invisibly as possible, running from any interception rather than engaging it, returning with film rather than victories. The aircraft they flew, stripped of weapons and armor to maximize speed and altitude, were extraordinarily quiet inside by the standards of military aviation. The cockpit insulated enough that the engine's noise was reduced to a low vibration rather than the overwhelming roar of combat aircraft. flying over Germany or occupied Europe at 40,000 feet in this relative quiet. Photographing the landscape below with methodical precision was an experience that several reconnaissance pilots described as the most isolated of the entire war. A silence and a solitude so complete that the continent spread out beneath them seemed almost abstract, a map rather than a place, until the flak began to arrive and the silence ended and the aircraft was no longer alone in the sky. Fact number 25. Resistance couriers moving through occupied cities with documents hidden on their bodies learned to read the silence of a street in a way that ordinary pedestrians did not need to. A street that was normally busy at a certain time of day but was quiet was not simply quiet. It was communicating something. Perhaps a checkpoint had been established further along. Perhaps an arrest had taken place recently enough that people were still avoiding the area. Perhaps something was about to happen that the street's ordinary inhabitants had already been quietly warned about. The courier who turned around before reaching the checkpoint she could not yet see, who took the longer route because something about the silence of the usual route felt wrong, was not acting on specific intelligence. She was acting on the accumulated knowledge of a person who had spent months learning to read the city as a text, its sounds and silences as language, its pedestrian patterns as information. Several resistance memoirs from different occupied countries describe close escapes that were not the result of specific tip-offs but of exactly this kind of environmental literacy, the ability to hear what a street was saying in the particular quality of its silence. Fact number 26. Japanese civilians listening to the radio in August 1945 encountered a silence before the Emperor's broadcast on the 15th that was unlike any silence in the history of Japanese public communication. The announcement that an important broadcast would be made at noon had reached the population the previous day. It would be the first time in history that the Emperor would speak directly to his people. By noon on the 15th of August, virtually every radio in Japan was turned on. Every person within hearing of a radio was standing or sitting in stillness. The silence before the broadcast was the silence of a nation that had been told something unprecedented was about to happen and had no framework for understanding what that something might be. People described stopping whatever they were doing and gathering around the nearest radio with a quality of collective suspension. Work halted, conversations abandoned, the ordinary business of the day simply paused. When the broadcast began, the Emperor's voice was unfamiliar to most of his subjects who had never heard it. When it ended and the meaning of what he had said had been understood, that Japan was surrendering and the war was over, the silence that followed was of a completely different kind, shaped by grief and relief and disbelief in proportions that varied by household, but in every account that survives it contained all three. Fact number 27. There was a particular silence that settled over a street in the hour before an expected air raid that civilian populations in heavily bombed cities came to recognize and respond to with a reliability that had nothing to do with official warning systems. It was the silence of a street emptying, not dramatically, not all at once, but progressively as individual people and families made the quiet calculation that the night's conditions were favorable for a raid and began, without announcement, to move toward their shelters. A street that had been ordinarily populated would, over the course of 20 or 30 minutes, become noticeably emptier, its ambient sounds reducing as the people who generated them withdrew indoors or underground. Those who noticed this progressive emptying and understood what it meant joined the movement. The silence of a street emptying before a raid was a community warning system built from nothing except the accumulated wartime knowledge of millions of individuals making similar calculations simultaneously. Informal, uncoordinated, entirely reliable, and entirely invisible to any official record of how early warning was communicated to civilian populations. Fact number 28. During the liberation of concentration camps by Allied forces in the spring of 1945, the soldiers who entered them described a silence that none of their training or experience had prepared them for. The camps were not empty. They contained thousands of survivors, many of them barely alive, many unable to move from where they lay. What the liberating soldiers encountered was the silence of extreme human suffering at a scale and a depth that had moved beyond ordinary expression into something for which no vocabulary existed. People who could speak did not always speak. People who could move did not always move. The silence was not the silence of unconsciousness or death. It was the silence of people who had been in these conditions long enough that the ordinary human impulse towards sound and communication had been suppressed to a depth that liberation alone could not immediately reverse. Soldiers who entered these camps and have spoken about the experience in the decades since describe the silence as the thing that stayed with them longest, longer than the visual images, longer than the smell, longer than the specific scenes that official accounts record. The silence of the camps in those first hours was the sound of what the war had done at its most extreme, a silence so complete and so human that it constituted in itself a form of testimony that words then and since have struggled to approach. Fact number 29. A telephone exchange that went quiet in wartime, the lines suddenly cleared of their ordinary traffic, was a signal experienced by telephone workers across every major city that something significant had either just happened or was about to. Telephone traffic patterns in wartime cities were sensitive indicators of public events. A bombing raid produced a surge of calls, then a drop as people took shelter, then another surge as the all clear sounded and families tried to locate each other. An unexpected political announcement produced its own pattern. An unexpected silence, a drop in traffic at a time when traffic should have been normal, meant something too. Telephone exchange workers in London, Berlin and Tokyo all describe this sensitivity to traffic patterns as something that developed over months of wartime work into a practical sixth sense. The ability to feel, through the volume and pattern of calls being routed, the emotional state of the city being served. The silence on the lines was not just an operational condition, it was information about what was happening to the people generating or failing to generate the calls, and the specific quality of a silence that arrived when it should not have was among the more reliable indicators that something in the city had changed. Fact number 30. Children who had been evacuated to the countryside and then returned home to bombed cities described in later accounts a specific experience of silence in their damaged neighborhoods that had nothing peaceful about it. They had been gone long enough for the bombing to have done its work. Streets they had known had been altered in ways that their months in the countryside had not prepared them to see. Coming back to a street where several houses were now absent, where gaps existed in the terrace like missing teeth, where rubble had been cleared to leave flat spaces that the eye kept trying to fill with the buildings that should have been there, was experienced as a silence that was also a visual phenomenon, a scene quiet as much as a heard one. The missing houses had generated sounds, the families in them, the specific acoustic contribution of a family to the shared soundscape of an apartment building or a street, were present and then, at a specific moment, were not. Children returning to these streets were experiencing something that the adult language of wartime had not developed adequate words for. The specific grief of a place that has been altered in ways that cannot be undone, perceived through the body's sensitivity to what is missing from a landscape that was once completely known. Fact number 31. Something about the way a commanding officer paused before speaking told experienced soldiers more than the words that followed. This was true across every army of the war, British, American, German, Soviet, Japanese, and it was understood by men who had served long enough to read the specific vocabulary of their officers' silences with the fluency of a second language. A pause before routine orders meant nothing. A pause before an operational briefing that was longer than usual, accompanied by a particular stillness in the officer's body, meant something entirely different. Veterans describing these moments in post-war interviews return repeatedly to the same observation, that the silence before the words was where the real information was, that the few seconds in which the commanding officer collected himself before speaking contained a compression of what was coming that the speech itself then simply expanded. Men who had learned this reading sat in briefings with their attention directed not at what was being said, but at the gap before it was said. The pause, the breath, the specific way a man arranged his face before delivering news he knew his audience would find difficult. The words confirmed what the silence had already communicated. By the time the orders arrived, the men receiving them had already, in the most fundamental emotional sense, begun to absorb them. Fact number 32. Leningrad, during its 872-day siege, developed a relationship with silence that the city's survivors described as one of the defining features of the entire experience. The city had been famous before the war for its cultural noise, its theaters, concert halls, cafes, its streets full of the particular energy of one of Europe's great cities. By the winter of 1941 to 1942, when the siege had tightened to the point where the daily bread ration had fallen to 125 grams for non-working adults, the city had gone quiet in a way that was directly related to the physical depletion of its population. People who do not have enough to eat do not generate the sounds of ordinary life. They move more slowly, speak less, conserve energy in every available way, including the energy required for speech and social interaction. The silence of a starving city is not the silence of a peaceful one, and the Leningraders who survived the worst winter of the siege described a specific quality of urban quiet they had never encountered before and never encountered again. The silence of an enormous human community reduced by hunger to the most minimal expression of its own existence, continuing to live but no longer able to make the sounds by which living normally announces itself. Fact number 33. Hiding in a confined space while searchers moved through the building above or around you produced a form of enforced silence that those who experienced it described as among the most physically demanding of the entire war. The false bottom of a cart, the space beneath a farmhouse floor, the sealed room behind a bookcase. It was not enough to be quiet in the ordinary sense of not speaking. It was necessary to control the body's involuntary sounds, the breath that wanted to be deeper than safety permitted, the cough that built in the throat over minutes and had to be suppressed by sheer muscular effort, the heartbeat that seemed in the extremity of the moment, loud enough to be heard through the floor. People hidden in these spaces during German searches across occupied Europe describe a quality of bodily self-control that went beyond anything they had previously experienced, a concentration of will directed entirely inward, toward the management of the body's own sounds, while the sounds of the searchers moved through the space above them with a proximity that made every footstep a separate event to be survived. The silence they maintained was not passive. It was active in the most physical sense, produced minute by minute through the continuous effort of people who understood that the sound of a single uncontrolled breath might be the last sound they made in freedom. Fact number 34. Naval vessels maintaining radio silence on the approach to an operation existed in a specific communicative isolation that their crews felt as a physical condition as much as a tactical one. The ship was surrounded by other ships, a convoy, a task force, an invasion fleet, but the normal channels through which those ships communicated were closed. The resulting silence was a silence of known but unreachable company, a form of isolation experienced within proximity rather than across distance. Operators whose entire professional function was the management of radio communications sat at their equipment in silence, monitoring frequencies they were forbidden to transmit on, receiving the ambient signals of the electromagnetic environment without being able to add to them. The silence was not permanent. The operation would begin and the radios would open and the traffic would resume. But in the hours of its duration, the radioman's silence was a compressed form of the tactical situation itself, the fleet holding its breath, the operation not yet begun, the moment before everything that was about to happen still containing the possibility of everything going according to plan. Fact number 35. What happened in a household in the minutes after a family member left for the front was something that wartime families across every combatant nation experienced and that several described with a precision suggesting the memory had been stored at unusual depth. The house was the same house. The remaining family members were in it, and they were not silent in any absolute sense. There were things to be done, children to attend to, the day to be gotten through, but the specific silence left by that particular departure was present alongside all of it, a quality in the air of rooms that had contained that person and now did not, the particular way a coat hook looked when the coat that had hung on it was gone. Some family members described going about the morning's tasks with a deliberateness that was itself a response to the silence, keeping busy as a management strategy, filling the acoustic space that the departure had opened with the sounds of domestic activity, because the alternative, standing still in the silence and fully feeling what it meant, was something the morning did not yet have room for. The coat hook was empty. The path outside was empty. The day had to be gotten through, and they got through it, in the specific silence of people who had just said goodbye and did not know when hello would come again. Fact number 36. Medical staff working in civilian hospitals during bombing raids described a specific redistribution of silence that took place inside the building as a raid intensified outside it. The wards, which in ordinary circumstances were never fully quiet, became quieter as the raid progressed outside. The patients who were conscious going still in a particular way that nurses recognized as the body's instinctive response to external threat. Conversations between staff were reduced to the minimum required for the work. Instructions were given quietly. Equipment was handled with more care than usual, its potential sounds managed with the specific attentiveness of people who understood that the sounds outside were the relevant sounds and that adding to the interior noise somehow felt wrong. What these accounts describe is a collective, unspoken, entirely intuitive redistribution of acoustic attention, the hospital's interior going quieter as the exterior went louder, the staff and patients together producing a silence that was not fear but something more functional than fear, a collective focusing of attention that the body achieves automatically when the situation demands everything available, and noise is the first thing it releases. Fact number 37. Among the stranger silences of the war was the silence that fell over communities after a victory that had cost more than it had been expected to cost. This was not the silence of defeat, which had its own well-documented character. It was a silence that arrived in the middle of what should have been celebration and disrupted it, a recognition arriving faster than official communications had anticipated that the victory being announced had a specific human cost attached to it, present in the community in the form of specific families who were not celebrating. The liberation of a town, an island taken, an objective finally secured after weeks of fighting. These were genuine achievements worth acknowledging, but in the communities that had provided the men who took the casualties, the acknowledgement arrived already complicated by the knowledge of what it had cost. Parades in which some households drew their curtains, bells rung in churches where some families did not come to hear them. The specific silence of people who understood what had been won and what had been paid for it, and who were not yet sure which of the two they were feeling. Fact number 38. Watching someone read a letter from the front and trying not to watch them. Trying to continue with whatever occupied your hands while their face told you everything the letter was telling them. This was one of the more common and more difficult wartime domestic experiences. The reader was silent because reading is silent, and the watcher was silent too, because asking questions while the reading was happening was an intrusion. The silence between them was filled with everything the letter might be saying and everything that the face of the reader was beginning to confirm or deny. If the face relaxed, the watching family member could breathe. If the face did something else, if the reading slowed, if the eyes went back to the beginning of a line, if the hand that held the letter tightened slightly, the silence in the room changed character, acquired a weight that the reader's expression was already beginning to fill with specific content before a word had been spoken. The etiquette of watching someone read a wartime letter had no formal rules, but it had an entirely understood practice. You did not ask, you watched, you waited, and you read the silence between the reader and the letter for whatever it was already telling you about what you were about to be told. Fact number 39. In the final weeks of the Battle of Berlin in April and early May 1945, the city experienced a specific acoustic phenomenon that its surviving civilian inhabitants described consistently in post-war accounts. The silence between artillery impacts, which in the earlier phases of the battle had been brief, became progressively shorter as Soviet forces tightened their encirclement, until the silence between shells was barely enough to draw a breath. But this progressive reduction of silence was itself a form of information. It told the people enduring the bombardment, with a precision that no official announcement could have matched, exactly how close the front had come, and exactly how little of the city remained between them and it. The silence had been shrinking for days, its diminishing duration a direct measurement of distance, and the people in the cellars of Berlin tracking this shrinkage knew what the narrowing silence meant without needing to be told. When the silence finally disappeared altogether, when the impacts became continuous enough that no gap remained between them, the city that had been listening to its own diminishing quiet for weeks understood, in the most physical and immediate way possible, that the end had arrived. Fact number 40. Coming home to an empty house, a house that should have had someone in it and did not, was an experience that wartime produced in enough different forms to make it one of the period's defining civilian encounters with the wrong kind of silence. The soldier returned on leave to find the family had been evacuated and no message had arrived. The woman came home from her shift to find the neighbor standing at the door with the expression that meant the telegram had come while she was out. The child returned from school to find the house dark when it should have been lit, quiet when it should have had the sounds of a parent in it. Each of these encounters with an unexpectedly empty, unexpectedly silent house had its own specific character, but they shared an essential quality. The silence of a domestic space that should have been inhabited and was not, encountered at the moment of return, when the body's expectation of presence, the sounds of the inhabited house heard internally before the door was opened, collided with the reality of absence. That collision between the expected sound and the actual silence was one of the sharper edges of wartime domestic experience. Small in scale, entirely private, and capable of delivering in the moment of a door opening onto an empty room the full weight of what the war was costing the people living inside it. Fact number 41. Frost on the windows of a farmhouse in rural Ukraine in the winter of 1941 meant that the family inside had stopped heating the rooms, and in a village where the German occupation had stripped the community of its fuel reserves, its food stores, and a significant portion of its male population, the silence of a house that had stopped producing warmth was a signal that the neighbors who noticed it understood without needing to investigate. The unlit window at nightfall, the absence of smoke from the chimney on a morning cold enough to see breath in the air, these were the visible equivalents of a silence, the signs by which a community tracked its own condition and registered the points at which individual households had crossed from difficulty into something worse. Village life in occupied Eastern Europe operated through this kind of mutual environmental reading, the community maintaining a constant low-level awareness of itself through the observation of the small signals that daily life produces, and that their absence or alteration made legible as distress. The frost on the window was information, the cold chimney was a sentence. The neighbors who read these signs and acted on them, arriving with whatever small quantity of food or fuel could be spared, were responding to a communication that had been made without words and received without words and answered without words, in the specific silent language of people looking out for each other in conditions that had reduced everything to its most essential form. Fact number 42. Experienced sailors aboard convoy escort vessels during the Battle of the Atlantic developed an almost musical sensitivity to the sounds their ships made, the engine's rhythm, the particular noise of the hull moving through different sea states, the specific acoustic character of the vessel in different conditions, precisely because any deviation from these known sounds was itself a signal, a change in engine note, a sound from below the waterline that had not been there on the previous watch. The specific, unmistakable sound of a torpedo detonating against another ship in the convoy, a sound that sailors who had heard it once described as unlike anything else in their experience. Between these events the watch was silent in the way that night watches at sea are silent. The water, the engine, the wind, the occasional creak of the vessel adjusting to the sea, and the experienced sailor moved through this silence with a quality of listening that was not tense exactly, but was never fully relaxed. A permanent low-level alertness that had been trained into the nervous system over months of watches, in which the silence had sometimes remained silence, and had sometimes ended in the specific sound of catastrophe arriving without warning from below. Fact number 43. Somewhere in northern France in the spring of 1944, a farmer noticed that the usual German patrol had not come down his lane at its usual time. The patrol had been a feature of the occupation's daily rhythm for nearly 4 years, arriving with a regularity that had itself become a form of oppressive normality. The sound of boots on the lane at predictable intervals a constant reminder of the occupation's presence. When the patrol did not come, the farmer's first response was not relief but alertness. The absence of a sound that had been reliably present was information. It meant something had changed, and in occupied France in the spring of 1944, change in the occupation's routine patterns was something to be read carefully. Resistance networks across northern France had learned to track exactly these kinds of deviations, not the dramatic events that announced themselves, but the small alterations in the occupation's acoustic texture that signaled shifts in German priorities or troop movements. The patrol that did not come, the vehicle that took a different route, the checkpoint that was unmanned at an hour when it was always manned. These silences in the occupation's routine were the intelligence that the resistance read before any other source confirmed it. The farmer kept his own counsel, continued his work, and filed the absence of the patrol in the part of his mind where useful information was stored. Fact number 44. Grief in wartime had a specific relationship with public silence that differed from peacetime bereavement in ways that shaped how it was expressed and how it was received. In peacetime, the bereaved person occupied a recognized social role, the mourner, with established rituals, acknowledged needs, and a community prepared to accommodate the expression of loss. In wartime, grief arrived so frequently and in such quantities that the social infrastructure designed to support it was simply overwhelmed. Women who had lost husbands described the specific pressure of wartime bereavement, the expectation that grief would be contained, that the household would continue functioning, that the children would be fed, the shifts would be worked, and the public face of adequacy would be maintained regardless of what was happening inside. This pressure produced a specific form of silence around individual grief, a silence not of recovery but of management. The grief present and real and undiminished, but conducted in private, in the small hours, in the specific aloneness of a house after the children were in bed. The silence of wartime grief was not the silence of people who were not suffering. It was the silence of people who were suffering in the specific circumstances of a world that needed them to keep going, and who had found, because they had no other option, that keeping going and suffering are not mutually exclusive. Fact number 45. What the inhabitants of a bombed street noticed first, in the days after a direct hit on a neighboring house, was often not what was present but what was absent. Specifically, the sounds that the destroyed house had always contributed to the street's acoustic environment and that the street now produced without. Every occupied house generates a continuous low-level soundscape that its neighbors absorb without conscious attention. The specific sounds of a family's morning routine, the particular hour at which that household's radio was turned on, the sound of children in the back garden at certain times of day, the specific quality of sound produced by a house that is lived in and warm and inhabited by people going about their lives. The destruction of such a house removed all of this simultaneously, not just the physical structure but everything the structure had contained and generated, the entire specific contribution of that household to the shared soundscape of the street. The neighbors who remained described this removal as one of the more persistent effects of the bombing. The street sounding wrong not because of any new sound the bomb had introduced, but because of the specific sounds it had permanently removed, sounds whose presence had been so constant and so unremarkable that their absence was far louder than they had ever been. Fact number 46. Interrogation rooms in German-occupied Europe were understood by resistance members who had been trained to expect them as spaces in which silence was simultaneously a right, a strategy, and an act of protection for people who were not in the room. The training that resistance networks gave their members about how to behave if arrested included specific instruction about silence, about what to say, what not to say, how long to maintain particular positions, and how to use the silences within an interrogation as tools rather than simply as the absence of confession. But the trained knowledge of what silence was for in an interrogation room was different from the experience of actually sitting in one and producing that silence under the specific pressures being applied. Veterans of resistance, arrest and interrogation who survived to give post-war accounts describe the silence they maintained not as the absence of speech but as something actively produced, generated continuously, under conditions designed to make its production impossible, out of the specific motivation of knowing that what they did not say might be the difference between a colleague's survival and their death. The silence was not empty. It was full of exactly what the interrogators were trying to extract from it, held there by will and by loyalty, and by the understanding that the information the silence contained belonged not to the person being questioned but to the people the questions were designed to reach. Fact number 47. Dawn on the morning of the 6th of June 1944 arrived over the Normandy coast with a specific quality of silence that the German defenders in their positions above the beaches experienced in the minutes before the Allied bombardment began. The sea was there, its sounds present, the particular noise of water against the base of cliffs and the shingle of beaches, but the other sounds that should have accompanied a normal pre-dawn hour on this coast, the sounds of a military routine beginning its day, were absent, replaced by a quality of held stillness that several German soldiers described in post-war accounts as the silence of something about to happen. A naval bombardment that opened at approximately 5:30 in the morning ended that silence with a comprehensiveness that left no room for any other acoustic experience. But the silence before it, the specific quality of the pre-dawn coast in the minutes before the largest seaborne invasion in history began, was itself a communication that the defenders in their positions above the beaches had been given and had not been able to fully read. The sea was quiet, the sky was lightening, and somewhere out there in the dark water, in a silence that was about to end, the Allied fleet was in position and waiting for its orders. Fact number 48. Doctors making their rounds in hospitals serving civilian casualties developed a specific sensitivity to the silence of individual patients that went beyond clinical assessment of consciousness or responsiveness. A patient who had been unconscious and became quiet in a different way, a quality of stillness different from the stillness of unconsciousness, was communicating something that experienced doctors and nurses recognized before they could formally confirm it. This reading of a patient's silence, the ability to distinguish between the silence of deep unconsciousness, the silence of sleep, the silence of a person withdrawn into pain, and the silence of a person moving toward death, was a skill developed through sustained clinical experience under conditions that the wartime casualty load had made intensive in ways that peacetime medicine rarely matched. Nurses who worked through the heaviest bombing periods describe this sensitivity as something that developed over weeks and months of close observation, the gradual accumulation of a clinical vocabulary of silence that formal medical training had not included but that the work itself had made necessary. The patient's silence was not the absence of information. It was, for those trained by experience to read it, one of the richest sources of clinical information available, telling the attentive observer, in its specific quality and character, more than many spoken symptoms could convey. Fact number 49. In the Soviet Union, the specific silence that fell over a workplace when the political officer entered the room was different from any other workplace silence, different from the silence that accompanied a supervisor's arrival, different from the silence of concentration, different from the silence of a group of people who have simply stopped talking because a task requires attention. It was a silence produced by a specific form of social fear, the fear of speaking in the presence of a person whose job was to listen for what was said and to assess its ideological content. Workers in Soviet factories, collective farms, and military units who have described this silence in post-war memoirs are consistent in characterizing it as a physical experience, a change in the air of the room, a collective recalibration of every person present toward a posture of neutrality that was itself a performance, the performance of people who had nothing to hide and nothing to say that was not entirely correct. The political officer understood the silence perfectly. Its production was in a sense part of his function. The silence itself was proof that the room's occupants were sufficiently aware of his role and sufficiently cautious of its implications. The silence was both the response to his presence and the demonstration that his presence was working as intended. Fact number 50. Children separated from their parents, evacuated to the countryside, interned in camps, or simply displaced by the movement of the war across their homes and communities, often went through a period of silence that caregivers who worked with them found both unmistakable and difficult to address. It was not selective mutism in any clinical sense. The children were not unable to speak, and many spoke normally in some contexts while remaining entirely silent in others. It was something more specific, a silence produced by the removal of the relational context within which the child had learned to speak and to expect speech to be received. A child who had always spoken into the specific, known, reliable presence of a parent found in the presence of strangers that the social technology of speech, the trust that what you say will be received in the way you intend it, had been temporarily suspended by the removal of the person who had always provided that reception. Several workers with displaced and evacuated children during the war noted that this silence tended to resolve not in response to direct attempts to elicit speech, but in response to the gradual establishment of reliable, consistent, non-demanding presence. The adult who simply stayed, who was there each day, who did not press for speech but made speech feel safe when it came. The children spoke when they were ready. What they needed before they were ready was not encouragement, it was the specific, patient silence of someone waiting without requiring. Fact number 51. Somewhere in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday in a German city in 1943, a woman standing at her kitchen window saw the street outside go quiet in a way she had not seen before. Not the silence of an air raid warning. She knew that silence, and this was different. The people who had been walking along the pavement a moment before had simply stopped, or turned, or found reasons to be somewhere else, with the specific quiet efficiency of a crowd that has registered something it does not want to be seen registering. Further along the street, she could see why. A group of Jewish residents were being moved, marshaled along the pavement by uniformed men carrying what they had been permitted to carry, moving with the specific quality of people who understood what was happening and had no recourse against it. The street's silence was the silence of witnesses who were not witnesses, of people who saw and looked away and kept moving and said nothing, whose silence was itself a form of complicity that most of them would not examine directly for years, and some of them never. The woman at the kitchen window did not go outside. She stayed where she was, behind the glass, and watched until there was nothing left to watch. The street refilled with ordinary movement, the ordinary sounds returned. and what had happened was absorbed into the silence of a society that had developed, by that point, considerable practice at absorbing such things. Fact number 52. Snipers during the war occupied a professional relationship with silence that was more complete and more deliberate than almost any other combatant role. The sniper's effectiveness depended entirely on the absence of any signal, sound, movement, reflection, disturbance of the environment that would communicate his presence to the target or to those around the target. This required not merely the management of sound but the management of every physical output the body produces. Breath controlled to the pace of the shot, heartbeat attended to as a mechanical variable affecting aim, the body held in a stillness so complete that the natural human tendency toward movement had to be consciously overridden for hours at a time. Soviet snipers operating in the ruins of Stalingrad, German snipers in the bocage of Normandy, Finnish snipers in the winter forests of Karelia, all operated within this discipline of total silence, and the accounts they gave afterward described the experience in remarkably similar terms regardless of which side they were on. The silence was not emptiness, it was the fullest possible occupation of the present moment, a state of total environmental awareness conducted in total physical stillness, the mind recording everything while the body produced nothing. Several veteran snipers described it as the most concentrated form of existence they had ever experienced. The world reduced to the intersection of crosshairs and a breath, held in a silence so complete that the shot when it came was the loudest thing in the world. Fact number 53. News of a military disaster reached home front populations through several channels simultaneously, and the silence that accompanied its arrival was shaped by which channel delivered it first. Official announcements were crafted to minimize panic, framed in language that acknowledged loss while managing its scale, but the unofficial channels preceded the official announcement often enough that civilian populations had frequently begun to understand the shape of a disaster before its formal confirmation arrived. The letter from a soldier to his family describing conditions that contradicted the official version. The word passed through a network of military wives whose husbands served in the same unit. The specific silence of a war office that had stopped issuing routine updates about a particular theater. The silence from official sources was itself a form of communication in these circumstances. The absence of the routine reassurances that normally arrived when things were going according to plan was read by attentive civilians as the presence of something that official language was not yet ready to describe. Families with relatives serving in areas covered by these official silences developed a specific and exhausting vigilance, monitoring the newspapers not only for what they said, but for the gaps between what was said, the stories that ended without resolution, the casualty figures that stopped being updated, the silence where information had previously been. Fact number 54. A lighthouse keeper on a remote section of the British coastline during the war occupied a particular listening post that combined official function with an isolation so complete that the silence around him was both professional tool and daily condition. The lighthouse's purpose was navigational, but its keeper was also, inevitably, a monitor of the acoustic environment of the surrounding sea. Sounds that should not have been present in that stretch of water at that hour were all information that the keeper was positioned by his professional isolation to receive before anyone else. An engine note that belonged to no expected vessel, the distant sound of an impact below the horizon, the specific acoustic signature of a submarine running on the surface in waters that should have been clear. Several lighthouse keepers on the British coastline submitted reports during the war that contributed to the detection of U-boat activity, enemy mine-laying operations, and the movements of coastal forces, not through the use of sophisticated equipment, but through the simple mechanism of a person who had spent years learning what silence in that specific stretch of water should sound like, and who noticed when what he heard did not match what he knew. Fact number 55. When the Soviet army entered a village that had been under German occupation and the German forces had just withdrawn, the village produced a specific silence in the hours immediately following liberation that the Soviet soldiers entering it described with a consistency that suggests it was a genuine and recognizable phenomenon. The silence was not the silence of an empty place. The village was inhabited. The residents were present. It was the silence of people who had been living under occupation long enough that the habits of silence the occupation had required had become deeply enough installed that they could not be immediately released simply because the occupiers were gone. Residents who had not spoken freely in public for months or years did not immediately begin to do so when Soviet soldiers arrived. They watched, they assessed, they waited to understand what this new presence meant before committing to the social behavior it might permit. The Soviet soldiers, who had liberated enough villages to recognize this silence, described it not as hostility, but as the specific caution of people who had learned at considerable cost that the arrival of a new military force did not automatically mean the arrival of safety. The silence was not ingratitude, it was intelligence, the intelligence of people who had been wrong before about what a change in uniform meant. Fact number 56. Among the more psychologically specific wartime silences was the silence that filled a military hospital ward during the reading of letters aloud. This practice occurred in wards where patients with hand or eye injuries could not read for themselves, and where orderlies, nurses, or visiting volunteers would read correspondence aloud to men who needed to hear what had been written to them. The ward went quiet for this. A specific, respectful quiet, quite different from the ward's ordinary ambient noise, as though the other patients understood that the letter being read aloud was a private communication now occupying a public space, and that the appropriate response to this situation was the courtesy of silence. What the silence contained, for the men in the surrounding beds who were listening without appearing to listen, was complex. The awareness of their own absent letters, the specific longing produced by hearing someone else's domestic world described in the particular intimacy of a personal letter, the recognition of details that matched their own lives closely enough to produce a feeling that was not exactly envy but was adjacent to it. The reader's voice in the quiet ward was the only voice, the letter was someone else's, and the silence in which it was received was the silence of a room full of men who were each in their own way, somewhere else entirely. Fact number 57. Certain mornings during the Italian campaign had a specific quality that veterans of that theater described with unusual consistency. A silence in the hills that preceded German counterattacks with enough regularity that experienced Allied soldiers had learned to treat it as a warning. The normal sounds of a mountainous landscape in central Italy, birds, wind in trees, the distant sounds of agricultural life continuing in rear areas, were replaced on these mornings by a quality of stillness that had no natural explanation available to it. Animals had withdrawn. The birds that normally inhabited the hillsides were absent. Units that had been in Italy long enough to have learned this silence took it seriously as a tactical indicator, not as a formal intelligence product, but as the accumulated environmental reading of soldiers who had developed through months of fighting in a specific landscape, a sensitivity to its acoustic character that functioned as a practical early warning system. The hills were too quiet. The birds were gone. The experienced soldier adjusted his position and waited for what the silence was announcing. Fact number 58. Writing in a diary about the silence rather than about what broke it, choosing to record the quality of the quiet rather than the event that followed, was something that a number of wartime diarists did with a frequency suggesting they understood the silence as the more significant thing. A Birmingham woman whose diary from 1940 to 1945 is held in the Imperial War Museum archive made entries on at least a dozen occasions that describe not a bombing raid or a piece of news, but the specific quality of the quiet before something happened. The way the street felt in the hour before a raid. The particular stillness of a Sunday morning on which she later learned that a neighbor had received bad news. The silence of her own house on a morning when she had an appointment at the War Office that she did not yet know the outcome of. These entries are among the most interesting in the entire diary precisely because they record something that most documentary accounts of the war do not think to record. The specific texture of the moment before. The silence in which the event had not yet happened, in which everything was still possible and nothing was yet determined. The diarist understood, without needing to theorize about it, that this silence was worth recording, that it was in its own way as much a part of the experience of living through the war as anything that the silence eventually gave way to. Fact number 59. Carrier pigeons returning to their lofts, the small, soft sound of wings against the air and then the specific sound of a bird settling onto its landing board, was a sound that handlers at military lofts across the war's various theaters had learned to wait for with a quality of attention that the sound's modesty did not fully account for. The pigeon carried messages that radio silence, equipment failure, or the destruction of other communication links had made impossible to send by any other means. Its arrival was therefore the arrival of information at a moment when information had been unavailable. the resolution of a specific uncertainty that might have been running for hours. Handlers described the specific experience of a pigeon's return after a long absence, after an operation in which it had been sent and not heard from, the silence of its non-return stretching past the point at which return was still expected, as one of the more emotionally complex of their wartime experiences. The bird settled, the message canister was removed, the information it contained was whatever it was. The pigeon had crossed whatever distance separated the silence from the knowledge of what was in it, and its arrival had ended the silence in the specific, unrepeatable way that only the arrival of the thing you have been waiting for can do. Fact number 60. The last day of April 1945 in Berlin was documented by the few civilians who survived it in the specific detail of its silences rather than its sounds, though both were present in abundance. In a city being reduced block by block through street fighting of extraordinary intensity, the silences between the sounds were what gave the day its particular character. A silence of a few minutes in a specific street might mean that the fighting had moved away from it, or that both sides were repositioning. A silence in the building you were sheltering in might mean the floor above was now empty, for reasons you could not know. A silence from the corner where someone had been a few minutes ago might mean anything at all. Civilian survivors of the last days of Berlin describe an experience of sound and silence so intertwined that the two could not be separated. The silence was always the silence between specific sounds, and the specific sounds were always arriving out of and returning to the silence, and the meaning of each required the other for its interpretation. The city was dying in that specific mixture of noise and quiet, and the people in the cellars of it were reading the mixture with the full attention of people for whom the ability to read it correctly was the most immediately practical skill available to them. Fact number 61. Returning prisoners of war described, with a consistency that post-war researchers found striking, a specific moment during their journey home when the silence of captivity gave way to something they had not immediately known how to receive. The ordinary, unmonitored silence of a world in which no one was listening to what they said. This transition was not instantaneous. Men who had spent years in camps where conversations were conducted with a permanent awareness of who else might be hearing them did not immediately stop filtering their speech when the camp gates were behind them. The habit of the managed silence, the reflexive check before speaking, the automatic assessment of the listening environment persisted beyond its necessity. Wives and mothers who had been waiting years for the return of someone who would finally be able to speak freely found in some cases that the man who had returned was quieter than the one who had left. Not from damage, though damage was sometimes present, but from the specific legacy of years spent in a social environment where silence had been the safer option, and where the habit of choosing it had been installed deeply enough that peace and its permissions had not yet had time to dislodge it. Fact number 62. Autumn nights in rural Poland under German occupation had a specific acoustic character that the farmers and villagers who lived through them described as one of the occupation's more persistent sensory legacies. The countryside at night had always had its own sounds, the animals in the barns, the wind across the fields, the specific night sounds of a landscape that did not stop being itself simply because human beings within it had stopped moving. What the occupation added to this natural night soundscape was a layer of human silence so complete and so deliberate that it transformed the experience of the rural night entirely. Nobody moved after curfew if they could avoid it. No light showed from any window. The roads were empty in a way that rural Polish roads had never been empty in peacetime. Under occupation, the night became a space of radical human withdrawal, a silence so complete that the natural sounds of the countryside, previously just the background to human nocturnal activity, became the entire acoustic world. Farmers who had lived in this landscape all their lives described finding the natural sounds of their own land alien in these conditions, the familiar sounds of animals and wind now isolated in a human silence that gave them a quality they had not possessed before, as though the night itself had changed when what had always been in it was removed. Fact number 63. Doctors delivering bad news in wartime had to do it more often and more quickly than peacetime medicine had prepared them for. And the silences that accompanied these deliveries, the silence before speaking, the silence after, and the silence in which the patient or the family absorbed what had been said, were silences that military and civilian physicians navigated with varying skill and a consistent understanding that how the silence was managed mattered as much as how the words were chosen. A doctor who delivered a diagnosis and then immediately moved to the next practical matter, who filled the silence after the words with more words, with treatment plans and next steps, and the business of medical management was closing a space that the patient needed to remain open for a moment longer. A doctor who could deliver the words and then wait, who could remain present in the silence that followed without rushing to fill it, was giving the patient something that was not medical in any formal sense, but that was in the circumstances as important as anything the medicine could offer. The specific dignity of being allowed to receive difficult news in your own time and in your own silence, without being required to respond before you were ready. Wartime physicians who developed this skill, and the accounts of patients and families who experienced it, describe it as one of the more human things the medical encounter produced, in conditions that the volume and pace of wartime medicine made genuinely difficult to maintain. Fact number 64. High above the English Channel on a clear night in 1943, a Royal Air Force bomber crew in the final minutes of approach to the enemy coast experienced a specific transition in the acoustic environment of their aircraft that several veterans of this route described in remarkably similar terms. The intercom, which during the earlier stages of the flight had carried the ordinary traffic of a working crew, position checks, engine readings, navigation updates, the comfortable functional conversation of men doing a complicated job together, went quiet, not silent, not turned off, but quiet in the specific way of a channel that is open and attended to but producing nothing, because the crew had reached the point in the approach where the things that needed to be said had been said, and the things that remained to be done required concentration rather than communication. This pre-target silence was a professional silence, the silence of competence at work. But it was also something else, acknowledged in the post-war accounts of the men who experienced it. The silence of a group of young men in a metal fuselage above an enemy coast who each knew, without needing to say it, that they were a few minutes from the place where what happened next was no longer entirely within their control. The intercom was open. Nobody spoke. The engines carried them forward through the dark. Fact number 65. What the neighbors of a Jewish family in an occupied city heard, or more precisely stopped hearing, in the days and hours before that family disappeared, was something that several non-Jewish residents described in post-war testimony with a precision and a guilt that years had not diminished. The sounds of a household, the specific acoustic contribution of a family to the shared soundscape of an apartment building or a street, were present and then, at a specific moment, were not. The morning sounds that had always come through the shared wall or the shared courtyard stopped. The specific sound of that family's door, which every building develops its own vocabulary of sounds from the particular quality of its doors and stairs and the movement of its inhabitants, was no longer heard. The silence arrived sometimes in the middle of the night, when the arrests were conducted in the specific hours designed to minimize public witness. The neighbors who heard the sounds of an arrest from behind their closed doors, or who woke the following morning to the specific silence of an apartment that had been inhabited and was now not, carried the memory of these silences with them for the rest of their lives, not always as guilt, though guilt was frequently present, but as the specific, irreducible personal knowledge of what the disappearance of a family sounded like from the inside of an adjacent life. Fact number 66. Waiting for a verdict in a German occupation court was an experience that the defendants who survived it described in terms of the silence of the room rather than the words that eventually broke it. The occupied countries of Europe produced, under German administration, a legal apparatus whose procedures were recognizable as courtroom procedures while being entirely unlike the peacetime courts they physically resembled. The same furniture, the same formal arrangement of defendant and judges, the same procedural language, producing verdicts that bore no reliable relationship to evidence or justice. Defendants who had been through these proceedings described the silence in the room before the verdict as the most complete and most terrible silence of their lives, a silence in which they understood perfectly that what was about to be said had been decided before they entered the room, that the proceedings they had just been subject to were a form rather than a process. The pause before a genuine verdict contains uncertainty. The pause before a predetermined one contains something else, a silence that knows itself to be theater, inhabited by a defendant who also knows, and who must sit in the silence of that shared and unspoken knowledge until the words arrive to confirm it. Fact number 67. Mountain warfare in Italy, Norway, and the Pacific produced a specific acoustic environment that soldiers who fought in high-altitude terrain described as unlike anything in the lowland theaters. The mountains amplified some sounds and swallowed others in ways that had no equivalent in the plains and hedgerows, and the silences between sounds were silences of a specific mountain character, deep, directionally ambiguous, capable of concealing the approach of forces in ways that the open landscape's silences could not. A patrol moving through high mountain terrain in silence was moving through a silence that was itself unreliable, that might be concealing another patrol, an artillery position, an observation post, or simply a mountain that had no military significance at all. The inability to trust the mountain's silence, to know whether the quiet hillside above was quiet because it was empty or quiet because it was managed, was one of the more psychologically demanding features of mountain warfare. It produced in the soldiers who experienced it a sustained state of environmental suspicion that veterans described as qualitatively different from the wariness that other landscapes required. The silence of a mountain in wartime was the silence of a very large place that could hold a very great deal within it without giving any of it away. Fact number 68. Coming off a night shift in a munitions factory in the north of England in the winter of 1942, a woman stepped out into the 4 o'clock darkness of a town that had been producing weapons through the night and that was now, in the brief gap between the night shift ending and the day beginning, producing almost nothing at all. The specific quality of a factory town's silence at that hour, the machinery stilled, the workers dispersed into the dark streets, the particular quiet of industrial machinery at rest, was something she recorded in her diary with a precision that suggests the silence struck her as worth noting, not as a relief though she was tired, not as unease, though she was always slightly uneasy in the dark outside the factory gates, as something she did not have a word for. The silence of an enormous collective effort paused between one shift and the next, the factory full of the potential of all the work it was about to resume, the street empty of the workers who would fill it again in a few hours, the town itself suspended in the brief, cold dark between one day's production and the next. She walked home through the empty streets and let herself in quietly and went to bed. The factory was silent. In a few hours it would not be. And somewhere, in the specific silence of the town between shifts, both of these facts were true simultaneously. Fact number 69. Animals in the agricultural landscape of occupied France served, for the farmers who tended them and watched them, as a continuous low-level environmental monitoring system whose readings the farmers had learned to take seriously after years of occupation. Cattle that became uneasy without visible cause. Dogs that oriented themselves toward a specific direction with a fixed attention that had no obvious explanation. Horses that refused to move in a direction they had always moved in without resistance. These behavioral signals were read by experienced farmers as acoustic and sensory information that the animals had received through channels unavailable to human perception. The German patrols and the resistance movements that the patrols were searching for both moved through the same landscape, and the animals registered their movement before human beings did. Farmers who were hiding resistant materials or people described paying close attention to their animals' behavior as a form of early warning that had saved them on more than one occasion. The cow that became restless 10 minutes before a patrol arrived along the lane, giving just enough time to move what needed to be moved before the boots came around the corner. The animal's silence, its failure to produce the specific behavioral responses that were its version of alarm, was reassurance. Its unease was the opposite, and in the specific circumstances of rural occupation, both were worth attending to. Fact number 70. The specific silence of a military cemetery, encountered for the first time by someone who had not visited one before, was an experience that many wartime civilians and veterans described as something their previous relationship with silence had not prepared them for. Cemeteries had always been quiet, but the military cemetery produced a silence of a different order, shaped by the specific features of its landscape, the rows, the uniformity, the sheer number of identical markers extending across ground that the eye could not resolve into individual human stories fast enough to prevent the scale from arriving first. Visitors to military cemeteries established during and immediately after the war, in North Africa, Italy, Normandy, across the Pacific, describe a specific quality of overwhelming in the silence of these places. Not the overwhelming of grief alone, but the overwhelming of scale. The mind struggling to hold the individual within the multitude, to find the specific human life within the row of identical stones. Some visitors described going quiet themselves in a way that was involuntary, not the chosen silence of respect, but the silence of a person whose normal emotional responses had been temporarily suspended by an encounter with something too large for those responses to accommodate. The cemetery was quiet. The silence it produced was not the cemetery's silence. It was their own. Fact number 71. Somewhere in the Pacific in 1943, an American signals intelligence unit intercepted a Japanese transmission and then heard nothing. A silence on a frequency that had until that moment been reliably active. The operators who monitored this frequency had spent months learning its character, its transmission times, its traffic patterns, its specific acoustic signature, with the thoroughness of people whose professional value depended entirely on understanding what they were hearing. The silence that replaced the transmission was therefore not simply the absence of a signal, it was a deviation from a known pattern. And deviation from a known pattern was, in signals intelligence, among the most significant things a frequency could produce. The unit's analysts began working immediately, not on what the silence said, because silence says nothing directly, but on what the silence meant, which was a different question entirely and a harder one. Had the transmitter been destroyed? Had the unit moved? Had the Japanese changed their communication procedures in response to a security concern? Each of these possibilities carried different operational implications, and the process of distinguishing between them required exactly the kind of sustained, patient, inferential intelligence work that the silence had created the need for. The frequency stayed silent, the analysts kept working, and the silence, which had begun as an absence of information, gradually became, through the work done around it, a source of information in its own right. Fact number 72. Growing up as a Jewish child in hiding in the Netherlands between 1942 and 1945 meant growing up inside a silence that had been explained to you, in terms calibrated to your age and your ability to understand, as the condition of your survival. Children hidden in attics, in cellars, in the back rooms of farm buildings and city apartments were told gently, carefully, and repeatedly that noise meant danger and silence meant safety, and that the management of their own sounds was something they were old enough to be responsible for. What this instruction produced in the children who received it was a relationship with their own voices and their own physical presence in space that peacetime childhood does not require children to develop. An awareness of the sounds their bodies made in the normal course of being alive, and a continuous low-level effort to reduce those sounds to a minimum. Adults who had been hidden as children and who described this experience in later life were consistent in reporting that the silence of their hiding had not felt, at the time, like deprivation. It had felt, because it had been explained to them as such, like competence, like the thing they could do, the contribution they could make, the way their existence did not have to be a danger to the people protecting them. The silence was their share of the work. They did it, day after day, with the specific seriousness of children who understood that the work mattered. Fact number 73. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows an explosion, not the silence of the moment immediately after, which is rarely silent at all and is instead full of secondary sounds, but the silence that settles 10 or 15 minutes later, when the immediate aftermath has resolved and the dust has begun to settle and the next thing has not yet been determined. Rescue workers who spent the Blitz working in this post-explosion silence described it as the silence they listened hardest in, the silence in which the sounds they were searching for were most likely to be audible if they existed at all. A voice from beneath rubble, a tapping on a pipe, the specific sound of someone alive in a confined space communicating their existence in whatever way was available to them. The rescue workers moved through the debris in this silence with a quality of listening so complete that they described being barely aware of their own movement, the body navigating the rubble on something close to automatic while the entire conscious attention was directed outward and downward, into the spaces beneath the collapsed structure, reaching for the sounds that would tell them where to dig. When those sounds came, a voice, a tap, a breath, the rescue workers described a specific quality of relief that had nothing to do with their own safety and everything to do with the information that the silence had finally delivered. Someone was down there, someone was alive, the listening had been worth it. Fact number 74. Border crossings during the war. Those points between occupied and unoccupied territory, between neutral and belligerent countries, between immediate danger and comparative safety, produced a specific experience of silence in the people crossing them that the geography of the crossing does not fully explain. The crossing itself might take minutes, a short walk across a field, a passage through a checkpoint, a boat ride across a narrow stretch of water. But the silence in which the crossing was made was not the silence of a brief journey. It was the silence of a person moving between two states of existence, carrying in their body the full weight of what they were leaving behind and the full uncertainty of what they were moving toward. In a moment that compressed both of these enormous realities into the specific, physical experience of moving from one side of a line to another, refugees who made these crossings under wartime conditions, many of them at night, many of them without official permission, many of them having left everything they owned in the zone they were leaving, described the silence of the crossing with an intensity suggesting it was among the most vivid experiences of their entire wartime, not because it was the most dangerous, though it was often very dangerous, but because it was the moment when the decision they had made was being physically enacted, when the life they were leaving was still close enough to touch, and the life they were moving toward was close enough to see, and the silence between them was all there was. Fact number 75. The night before a major offensive, military field hospitals positioned in forward areas were quiet in a specific way that the medical staff who worked in them described as unlike the hospital's silence at any other time. The wards were not full yet. The casualties that would fill them were still with their units, still alive, still part of the force that was about to move. The equipment was prepared, the supplies were checked, the surgical teams were as ready as they could be made. And in the space between this state of complete preparation and the moment when the preparation would be needed, the hospital existed in a silence that its staff described as the most self-consciously temporary of any silence they had ever experienced. Everyone in the building knew what the silence preceded. Everyone knew approximately when it would end. The nurses who sat in the staff room in that pre-offensive quiet and tried to sleep or read or talk described an inability to fully engage with any of these activities. The awareness of what was coming was too present and too specific to allow the normal absorptions of off-duty hours. They were resting in the technical sense of not working. They were not resting in any meaningful sense. The silence was the silence of a space that had been prepared for the worst and was waiting, in the specific quiet of complete readiness, for the worst to begin. Fact number 76. Occupied Denmark had a reputation among the occupied countries of Western Europe for a relatively moderate experience of the early years of German control, and this relative moderation produced a specific social silence that was different from the silences of more brutally occupied countries while being no less deliberate in its character. Danish civilians who disagreed with the occupation maintained a specific public silence about this disagreement that was shaped by the particular social codes of Danish civic culture. The Danes did not loudly protest. They did not in the early years actively resist in large numbers. What they did, with a consistency that the Germans found difficult to manage, was simply decline. Decline to engage with the occupiers socially. Decline to participate in the cultural events the occupiers organized. Decline to treat the occupation as a normal situation deserving of normal cooperative behavior. This social silence, the specific quiet of a population that was present and functional but simply refused to perform the normalcy that collaboration would have required, was its own form of resistance, conducted not through dramatic action but through the sustained withdrawal of ordinary social participation. It was a silence that said, without saying anything, that what was happening was not acceptable and would not be treated as though it were. Fact number 77. Field telephones at the front produced silences that forward observers and artillery coordinators learned to interpret with the same care they brought to the words that preceded and followed them. A line that went dead during an active fire mission was not the same as a line that had always been dead. It was a line that had been alive and was now not. And the difference between these two states of a wire carried tactical implications that required immediate response. Signal officers who managed the communication networks of forward units developed a sensitivity to these silences as part of the general situational awareness their job required. A network that was behaving normally was a network that sounded a certain way, a network that had gone wrong, through enemy action, through equipment failure, through the movement of units that had not been reported, sounded different, beyond the dead line. The field telephone produced other silences worth attending to. The silence of an expected call that did not come at its expected time. The silence of a headquarters that had been actively communicating and had stopped without explanation. The silence on a frequency that should have had traffic. The silence was often the first thing that told the signal officer that the network had changed. Fact number 78. The letters that were never sent, begun and abandoned, or completed and withheld, or written and destroyed before they could be posted, constitute a silence in the wartime record that archivists and historians have only recently begun to think carefully about. The letters that were sent and preserved tell one story about wartime communication. The letters that were not sent tell another. Soldiers who had things to say to families that military censorship would not have permitted, or things they could not bring themselves to ask their families to receive. Wives who wrote out the full truth of their situation, the fear, the loneliness, the financial difficulty, and then rewrote the letter in the version that would not add to their husband's burden. Parents who composed descriptions of how much they missed an evacuated child and then replaced them with cheerful accounts of how well things were going. The letters that were sent were carefully constructed acts of communication. The letters that were not sent were the silence underneath them, the things that were felt and thought and then withheld. For love, for protection, for the specific wartime discipline of keeping the worst to yourself so that the people you loved could be spared it. Fact number 79. Victory in Europe, announced on the 8th of May 1945, and celebrated with a public noise that the wartime years had not produced, contained within it a silence that the celebrations moved around rather than through. In the households where someone was missing, where the victory had come too late for a specific person, or where the victory in Europe meant only that the war in the Pacific continued for a son or husband stationed there, the noise of the celebration outside was the background against which a private silence was being maintained. Families who had lost someone in the final weeks of the European war, men killed in the last days of fighting before the surrender, existed in the middle of the public celebration in a specific and painful isolation. The flags were out. The streets were full. The radio carried the sounds of a nation releasing years of held tension into a single overwhelming moment of collective joy. And in the houses where the telegram had arrived recently enough that the wound was still open, the celebrations outside had the specific quality of sounds heard through a wall. Present, unmistakable, belonging to a world that was real and close and, for the moment, entirely unreachable. Fact number 80. The last entry in a wartime diary that stops without explanation. The final page of a notebook that simply ends, mid-thought or mid-sentence, or at the conclusion of an ordinary day's record, without any indication that it would be the last, carries a silence that the archivist or researcher who encounters it experiences as a specific and unsettling form of incompleteness. Some of these diaries ended because their keepers were killed. Some ended because the circumstances of the keeper's life changed in ways that made diary keeping impossible. Some ended simply because the notebook was full and no replacement was found, or because the habit that had sustained the diary through years of wartime ran out of momentum in the specific exhaustion of the war's final phase. The diary does not explain which of these is the case. It simply stops, and the silence after the last entry, the blank pages that follow it, or the back cover of the notebook reached without ceremony, is the silence of a story that has been telling itself day by day with the earnest particularity of someone who believed each day was worth recording, and that has stopped telling itself without telling you why. Reading that final entry knowing it is the final entry, though the person who wrote it did not know this, is one of the more affecting experiences that the wartime archive produces. The silence after the last words carrying everything that the words themselves could not say, because the words had stopped before they knew they needed to say it. Fact number 81. The silence that settled over a prisoner of war camp on the day the guards left was described by survivors across different camps in different countries with a consistency that suggests it was a genuinely universal experience. The guards had been the camp's acoustic infrastructure in ways that their continuous presence had made invisible. Their movements, their commands, their boots on gravel, their conversations between themselves had been the constant background against which everything else in the camp's daily life was conducted. When they were gone, the camp did not simply become quieter. It became a different acoustic environment entirely, a space that had been organized around the presence of armed authority and that was now organized around nothing. Men who had spent years learning the specific grammar of the camp's sounds, what each sound meant, what response it required, what safety or danger it signaled, found themselves in a space whose silence made none of the demands that any of those sounds had made. Several survivors described the first hours of liberation as among the strangest of their entire captivity. They were free. The silence said so, and the silence was, for that reason and in that moment, one of the most disorienting things they had ever heard. Fact number 82. What a child said when asked where their father was, and the particular silence that sometimes preceded the answer, was something that teachers in wartime schools across every combatant nation encountered regularly enough to develop, over time, a sensitivity to the specific quality of that silence that allowed them to calibrate their response before the words arrived. Some children answered immediately with the particular directness that children bring to facts they have absorbed thoroughly. He is in the Navy. He is in North Africa. He is working in a factory in Sheffield. And some children produced a silence that was its own answer, a stopping that the teacher understood without needing it completed, that communicated what the child could not yet put into words because the words had not yet been found for it in the household, because the household itself was still working out what to say. Fact number 83. Monasteries and convents that remained active during the war years, those in Italy, France, Belgium and the Netherlands that the conflict moved around or through, produced a specific intersection of their traditional silence with the wartime silence of the surrounding world that several of their inhabitants described as one of the more spiritually complex experiences of the entire period. Religious communities had always organized themselves around silence, the hours of contemplation, the disciplines of quiet, the specific relationship between interior life and exterior stillness that monastic tradition had developed over centuries. The war brought a different silence to their walls, not the chosen silence of contemplation, but the imposed silence of danger, of occupation, of hiding people in spaces designed for prayer. Several monasteries and convents across occupied Europe sheltered Jewish families, resistance members, and escaped prisoners in their buildings. The nuns and monks who managed this intersection, maintaining their contemplative life while sheltering the lives of others, described the experience as one in which the two silences had merged into something that was both at once, each giving the other a depth and a weight that neither would have carried alone. Fact number 84. Reading the casualty lists published in newspapers was something that wartime civilians did with a specific physical stillness. The paper held a little more carefully than usual, the eyes moving down the columns with a quality of attention that was simultaneously searching and dreading what the search might find. The lists were organized alphabetically. The reader who was looking for a specific name had to pass through all the names preceding it in the alphabet before arriving at the letter they were searching for, which meant that the search itself was a sustained encounter with the losses of other families, other names, each one someone's specific grief, accumulating as the eye moved down the column. When the relevant letter was reached, the specific silence of that moment, the few seconds in which the name had not yet been found or not found, was described by people who experienced this regularly as one of the more concentrated points of wartime anxiety. The name was there or it was not. The list did not soften either outcome. If the name was not there, the reader folded the paper with a relief that was genuine and temporary in equal measure. Temporary because the next list would be published, and the search would be conducted again, and the silence before the relevant letter was reached would be experienced again in the specific recurring rhythm of wartime anxiety that the weekly or daily publication of casualty lists imposed on the families of serving personnel. Fact number 85. What happened in a room when someone began crying and then stopped? The specific silence of tears suppressed, of grief managed back below the threshold of expression in the middle of its emergence, was something that wartime households produced regularly, and that the people in them had become, over the years of the conflict, quietly skilled at navigating. The suppressed cry was a feature of wartime emotional life precisely because the circumstances that produced grief were so frequent and so various that the full expression of each instance was practically impossible alongside the demands of continuing to function. A woman who allowed herself to cry every time the weight of the situation pressed hard enough to produce tears would spend a significant portion of her day crying, which the household's children and the household's demands did not permit. So the tears were managed, begun and stopped, or stopped before they began, or deferred to the specific privacy of a moment that the day might or might not provide. The silence that followed a suppressed cry, The specific quality of composure recovered by an act of will from a state of genuine distress was one that the people present in the room recognized and responded to with the particular tact of people who understood what they were seeing and understood also that pointing to it was not always the kindest response. The silence after the stopped tears was the silence of someone who had decided to keep going, and keeping going deserved to be respected on its own terms. Fact number 86. Neutral countries during the war occupied a specific acoustic position in the European conflict. They were not silent in the way that occupied countries were silent, because they had not been subjected to the specific suppressions of occupation. But they were not free in the way that countries at peace were free, because the war surrounded them and its pressures shaped their public life in ways that produced their own distinctive silences. Swiss newspapers maintained a careful neutrality about the war's combatants that required the specific silence of editorial restraint, the decision not to say certain things, not to characterize certain events in the language that accuracy might have suggested, because the diplomatic position of a small country surrounded by belligerents required a public discretion that was felt by the journalists practicing it as a significant constraint. Swedish radio maintained a similar discipline. Irish neutrality produced its own specific public silences about the conflict's nature and its stakes. The people living in these neutral countries were not unaware of what was happening around them. Many of them were acutely, helplessly aware of it. They simply had to conduct their awareness within a public silence that their governments had determined was the price of staying out. And the management of that silence, the gap between what was known and what could be publicly said, was one of the more uncomfortable features of the wartime neutral experience. Fact number 87. Returning to a house that had been damaged but not destroyed, coming back after an evacuation to find the structure standing but the interior changed by blast damage, by weather entering through broken windows, by the specific disarray that a bomb nearby produces in a domestic space, was an experience that its survivors described as a specific kind of disorientation produced by a specific kind of silence. The house was recognizable, the rooms were the same, the objects were largely the same objects, though some were broken and some displaced. What was missing was not primarily the physical objects. It was the sense of the house as inhabited, as warm, as the specific domestic space that the family had made through years of use and arrangement, and the particular way that people make their habitual marks on the places they live. The silence of a house that has been empty and damaged for weeks or months is different from the silence of a house simply empty for an afternoon. It is the silence of a space that has lost its animation, that has stopped being a home in the full sense and has become a building, a structure, a problem to be addressed rather than a place to be inhabited. The families who returned to these houses and set about making them homes again were doing something that required more than practical effort. They were repopulating a silence, filling it, gradually and deliberately, with the sounds of a household resuming its life. Fact number 88. There was a silence specific to the hours between the end of the fighting in a specific location and the arrival of the administrative machinery that would formalize the transition to whatever came next. The hours in which the military objective had been achieved but the peace had not yet been established, in which the landscape of recent combat was technically secured but not yet safe, in which the civilian population that had been sheltering was beginning to emerge into a world whose new rules had not yet been announced. Aid workers, journalists, and military personnel who spent time in these transitional hours across different theaters of the war described the silence of this specific interval with a consistency suggesting it was genuinely distinctive. It was not the silence of combat, which had its own well-documented character. It was not the silence of peace, which was something else entirely. It was the silence of a space between two states, a silence that contained the residue of what had just happened and the potential of what was about to, in a mixture that no single emotional category could adequately address. People moved through it carefully, the way you move through a space whose floor you are not entirely certain of, testing each step, attending to each sound, not yet convinced that the silence meant what it appeared to mean, and not yet prepared to act as though it did. Fact number 89. The specific silence of a ship at sea in the hours after a U-boat attack on the convoy, after the explosions, after the rescue operations, after the damaged vessels had been assessed and the dead counted and the survivors pulled from the water and whatever could be done had been done, was described by merchant sailors and naval escort crews as among the most lasting acoustic memories of the entire Atlantic War. The convoy continued. The ships that were intact maintained their formation and their course, because stopping was not an option, and the destination remained what it had always been. But the configuration of the convoy had changed. Gaps existed in the formation where ships had been. The specific sounds that those ships had contributed to the convoy's collective acoustic environment, their engines, their radio traffic, the sounds of their crews going about the work of sailing, were gone. The remaining ships moved through the space where the lost ones had been with the specific awareness of people who know exactly what the empty water beside them previously contained and who are continuing forward through that knowledge because forward is the only direction available. The sea was the same sea. The convoy was smaller. The silence in the gaps was not the silence of empty water. It was the silence of ships that had been and were not anymore, heard by the people who had been sailing alongside them and who would sail alongside that absence for the rest of the crossing. Fact number 90. Among the final silences of the war in the Pacific was the silence that fell over the Japanese home islands in the hours and days following the Emperor's surrender broadcast on the 15th of August 1945. A silence that was not simply the silence of a population absorbing news, but the silence of an entire cultural framework encountering information it had not been built to receive. The Japanese civilian population had been prepared, through years of official communication, for almost every possible outcome of the war except this one. Defeat had been discussed in terms of heroic resistance, of fighting to the last, of the specific honor available in refusing surrender. Surrender itself had not been presented as a possibility, and the cultural and psychological equipment available to civilians for processing it was therefore extremely limited. The silence that followed the broadcast was the silence of a people trying to find, within the frameworks of understanding available to them, a place to put something that none of those frameworks had been designed to accommodate. Some wept, some sat without moving for hours, some, by multiple accounts, simply continued what they had been doing before the broadcast, as though continuing were the only response available when all other responses had been rendered inadequate by the scale of what had just been said. Fact number 91. The silence of a hospital room in which someone was dying was managed differently in wartime than in peace, not because the dying was different, but because the people present for it were different, more practiced in the presence of death, more accustomed to loss arriving in various forms, more capable of remaining present in difficult circumstances without requiring the emotional scaffolding that peacetime prepared people less thoroughly to do without. Nurses, doctors, chaplains, and family members who sat with the dying in wartime hospitals describe a quality of presence in the silence of those rooms that several of them identified as something the war had given them. Not a comfort with death, which is not really available to human beings regardless of how much death they have encountered, but a specific capacity for remaining present within the discomfort, for sitting with the silence of a person leaving without needing the silence to be other than it was. The dying person's silence was received, in these accounts, as worthy of the same quality of attention that any other form of human communication deserved. The room was quiet, the person in the bed was the room's entire content, and the people sitting with them had learned through the specific education of a world at war, that being present in silence fully, attentively, without requiring anything of the silence except to be what it was one of the more important things that one human being can offer another. Fact number 92. What a street corner in a liberated city sounded like in the first hours after liberation. The specific mixture of voices, music, weeping, and laughter produced by a population releasing years of suppressed sound all at once was something that correspondents who witnessed it consistently described as unlike any other sound they had ever heard. But within that noise, and noticed by some of the more attentive observers, was a silence that moved through the celebration like a current beneath a surface. The people who were not celebrating, the families standing at the edge of the crowd whose particular losses made the liberation something other than uncomplicated joy, the survivors who had lost so much in the years preceding this moment that the moment itself arrived into a landscape of absence too extensive for celebration to fully cross. A French journalist covering the liberation of Paris in August 1944 described watching a woman standing on the pavement of the Champs-Élysées while the celebrations filled the street around her, entirely still, her face expressing something that he could not name and did not try to name in his dispatch, understanding that whatever it was hers and it was private, and the specific silence she occupied in the middle of the noise was one that the celebration could not reach and was not meant to. Fact number 93. The sound of rain on the roof of an Anderson shelter, that particular drumming of water on corrugated steel that wartime Britain produced in millions of domestic gardens, was something that the people who sheltered in them during raids described with a specific and paradoxical fondness in later years. The rain was the opposite of a bomb. It was ordinary weather, entirely unconnected to the war, falling on the shelter with the same indifference it fell on everything else: the garden, the street, the neighbor's roof, the countryside beyond the city. Its sound was therefore, in the specific circumstances of a shelter during a raid, a sound of normality arriving in an abnormal situation, a reminder that the world outside the war continued its own processes without reference to what human beings were doing to each other inside it. People who sheltered through raids described listening to the rain on the steel roof as a specific form of comfort, not because it made them safe, which it did not, but because its sound was the sound of something that had nothing to do with the war, that preceded the war and would outlast it. That was simply the weather being the weather in the specific, patient way that weather is. The bombs were the human thing. The rain was something else, something older, and its sound in the silence between the bombs was, in its small and unremarkable way, quietly reassuring. Fact number 94. Coming to the end of the war and finding that the silence you had been waiting for, the silence of the guns, the silence of the sirens, the silence of the things that had been making noise for years, was not in fact peaceful, was one of the more disorienting discoveries of the post-war months. Veterans and civilians alike described a specific difficulty with the silence of peace, not because they preferred the noise of war, which nobody did, but because the noise of war had been the acoustic environment in which they had become the people they now were. And the silence of peace was therefore the silence of a context that had been removed from beneath a self that had been built within it. The things that had structured daily life, the routines of civil defense, the disciplines of rationing, the specific demands of the wartime workplace, the alert attention that the general state of danger had maintained in the nervous system, were gone. And the silence they left was the silence of a structure removed. People describe this post-war silence in terms that are consistently more complicated than relief. A quiet that was welcome and strange simultaneously, that felt like freedom and felt like groundlessness. That was clearly better than what had preceded it, and that was, for reasons they found difficult to explain to people who had not experienced it, harder to inhabit than anyone had told them it would be. Fact number 95. Among the silences that the war produced and that the post-war world maintained longest was the silence around the specific experiences of those whose suffering did not fit the available categories of wartime heroism and sacrifice. The civilian who had collaborated under pressure and then stopped. The soldier who had broken and recovered and fought on. The survivor of atrocity who had made choices in the extremity of their situation that peacetime morality could not easily assess. The woman who had had a relationship with an occupying soldier and who now lived in a community that had decided what that meant about her. These people were not silent because they had nothing to say. They were silent because the social environment of the post-war world had not created the conditions in which their specific experiences could be said. Because the available narratives of the war, with their clear categories of hero and victim and villain, had no room for the complicated middle ground that most actual wartime experience occupied. The silence around these lives was not their silence. It was the silence of a social world that had not yet developed the capacity to hear them, that needed the distance of decades and the work of historians and the slow cultural willingness to receive complexity before the silence could begin, finally and incompletely, to give way to the fuller and more honest account that the actual experience of the war deserved. Fact number 96. The last German shell of the European war fell somewhere, on some specific piece of ground, into some specific silence, heard by some specific collection of people who understood or did not understand at the time that it was the last one. This is not a poetic claim. It is simply a fact that among the millions of shells fired in the European theatre between September 1939 and May 1945, one of them was the last one, and the silence that followed it was a silence of a different order from any that had preceded it, though nobody present could have known this with certainty in the moment of its occurring. The soldiers who were alive on the 8th of May 1945, and who had been in the war long enough to know what a world at war sounded like, were present for the arrival of a silence whose specific quality they had not heard since before the war began. The silence of a continent that had stopped fighting. It did not arrive cleanly or simultaneously. It arrived in pieces, at different times in different places, as units stood down and weapons were lowered and the specific sounds of combat ran down and stopped, one piece at a time, until what remained was the silence of a Europe that was damaged beyond any quick accounting. And that was for the first time in nearly 6 years, no longer at war. The silence was imperfect and incomplete and full of everything that would still need to be faced. It was also undeniably and at last, the silence of peace. Fact number 97. Survivors who testified at the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946 sat in a courtroom whose silence during the reading of testimony, during the examination of evidence, during the specific moments when what was being said was of a nature that the room could not immediately process, was a silence of a kind that the legal institution of the courtroom had not previously been asked to contain. Courtrooms have always been spaces of managed silence. The silence of respect for process, of attention to argument, of the formal gravity that legal proceedings impose on the people within them. The Nuremberg silence was all of these things and also something beyond them. The silence of an institution attempting to contain, within its established forms, an account of events that exceeded those forms in almost every dimension. When a survivor described what they had witnessed or experienced, the silence in the room was the silence of people receiving information that they understood they were required to receive fully and that full reception of was not easy or comfortable or something that the legal procedures surrounding it could adequately support. The judges took notes, the interpreters translated, the lawyers observed the procedure, and in the silence between the testimony and its legal processing, the specific, terrible weight of what was being said existed in the room in its own right, refusing to be entirely contained by the procedural forms designed to contain it. Fact number 98. Among the very last silences that the war produced was the silence of demobilization, the specific quiet that descended on military camps and barracks across every combatant nation as the men and women who had filled them through the war years were released, processed, and sent home in the millions. A camp that had housed 10,000 soldiers at the height of its activity and that was now housing a few hundred in the process of its own closing produced a specific silence of institutional emptiness, the silence of a large human machine winding down, its structures intact but its population gone, its routines suspended, its noise reduced to the specific quiet of a place that had been built for a purpose that no longer required it. The last soldiers to leave a closing military installation described the experience in terms that consistently exceeded the practical. There was something in the silence of the emptying camp that they found affecting in ways that their relief at leaving could not entirely account for. The camp had been the context of years of their lives. Its specific sounds, the réveil, the drill commands, the voices, the machinery, had been the acoustic environment in which they had become different people from the ones who had entered it. The silence of its emptying was therefore not simply the silence of a place going quiet. It was the silence of a chapter ending, the specific quiet of something that had been enormous and was now over, heard by the last people present who knew, from the inside, what the noise had been. Fact number 99. What the children of wartime said when they finally grew old enough to describe their experiences, in the oral history projects of the 1970s and 1980s, in the memoirs written late in life, in the conversations they eventually had with their own children about a childhood that had been different from any childhood their children were likely to encounter, was often when it touched on the silences of the wartime years, something that surprised the interviewers and the listeners with its specificity, not the dramatic events, the raids, the evacuations, the separations, but the silences, the particular silence of a house waiting for news, the silence that fell over the adults in a room when something came on the radio that the children were not supposed to hear, the silence of a parent who had just read something in a letter and had not yet decided how to describe it, the silence between two adults who had been discussing something before the child entered the room and who stopped discussing it with a smoothness that the child noticed and remembered, decades later, with complete clarity. These silences had been the children's primary access to the truth of the wartime situation, the places where the managed version of reality that adults presented to children had gaps in it, where the full weight of what was actually happening leaked through the seams of the protective narrative. In the specific, unmistakable form of adults who had stopped talking because the child had come into the room. Fact number 100. The silence of a cenotaph of any memorial to the war dead is a silence that the structure itself does not produce. Stone is simply stone. The silence is produced by the people who stand in front of it, who arrive at it with the specific quality of attention that the memorial has been designed to elicit, and who stand in it together in the particular shared quiet of collective commemoration. The annual 2-minute silence observed in Britain on Remembrance Day, begun after the First World War and continued through and after the Second, was one of the more extraordinary social experiments in collective silence that the modern world produced. The entire nation stopping simultaneously for exactly 2 minutes in whatever it was doing, to stand in a shared silence whose content was left entirely to the individual standing in it. No words were prescribed for those 2 minutes. No specific thought was required. The silence was simply offered, a shared, national, entirely personal space in which each individual was left alone with whatever the silence meant to them, in the specific privacy of their own memory and loss, while being simultaneously part of an enormous collective expression of something that language had repeatedly and inevitably failed to fully say. The 2 minutes ended, the noise of ordinary life resumed, and what had happened in the silence between was carried forward, privately and collectively, into all the ordinary days that followed. Fact number 101. The last silence of the war was not the silence of the guns or the silence of the surrender ceremonies or the silence of the liberated camps. It was a silence that arrived slowly, over years, as the people who had lived through the war aged and died and took with them the specific, irreplaceable, first-hand knowledge of what it had sounded like, the specific engine note of a particular aircraft, the specific quality of a city's silence during a specific raid on a specific night, the specific voice of a specific person saying a specific thing in circumstances that no document had recorded and no other living person had heard. This is the silence that accumulates at the far end of every human experience, the silence of the unrecorded particular, the silence of the thing that was real and present and fully experienced and that is now simply and irrevocably gone. The war produced more of this silence than most events in human history because it was larger and more varied and more deeply inhabited by more different kinds of people than almost anything that had come before it. And the silence that their passing leaves, the silence of the voices that are no longer available to tell what they knew, is the silence that this series has been, in its small way, attempting to speak into, not to fill it. Nothing fills it, but to acknowledge it, to sit with it for a moment, to say that what it contains was real and was important and was worth the attention of everyone who comes after, in the long silence of a world that was changed entirely by what those voices, while they lasted, had to say. Listening to these silences changes how the war sounds. It sounds less like the noise we associate with it, the bombs, the guns, the rhetoric, the machinery. It sounds more like what it actually was for the people inside it, a vast, sustained human experience conducted largely in the register of ordinary life, shaped at every point by the specific weight of things that could not be said, would not be said, were never said, or were said only in the silence that surrounded the words and gave them their true meaning. The war is over. The silences it produced are not. They persist in the archives, in the gaps between the documented facts, in the questions that the records raise and do not answer. They persist in the families that were changed by what their members experienced and never fully described. They persist in the places where the war happened and left its marks on the landscape in the form of things that are no longer there, the buildings, the communities, the specific human lives that the silence of their absence continues quietly and permanently to mourn. If there is something to take from this series into the quiet of whatever night you are ending as you reach these words, it is perhaps simply this: that silence is never empty, that the absence of sound is always full of something, and that the something it is full of, in wartime and in peacetime, in history and in the present moment, is almost always worth the attention required to hear it. Listen carefully. The silence has things to say. Rest now. You have heard enough for tonight. And the silence that follows is a good one. The silence of a quiet room, a safe house, an ordinary night. Hold it gently. It is worth more than it sounds.